And so relying on willpower motivation for long-term change is not a good strategy. But focusing on who you are and being transformed into a new person, in other words, shifting your identity, is what leads to lasting change. Hey, welcome back to the Known Disciple Project podcast. My name is Mark Hummel. I am your host, and this podcast is all about bridging the gap between personal development and spiritual formation for growth-minded Christians who want to live out and build a world of impact. So let me ask you a question. Why do we keep doing the things that we don't want to do? Why do you keep doing the things that you don't want to do? And you know exactly what I'm talking about as soon as I ask, right? Why do we keep scrolling when we don't want to keep scrolling? Why do we keep eating junk food when we've said we've had enough of that? Why do we keep hitting snooze when we say we're going to be a morning person? Why do we keep not reading and praying when we said that we're going to have discipline and we're going to show up different? Well, I'll tell you, it's not because you're lazy or because there's anything wrong with you. It's actually because your behavior, the things you do, follow your beliefs, the things you believe about you. And so in this episode today, we're going to unpack the beliefs behind your patterns, and we're going to teach you how to begin to shift those beliefs so that you can create new patterns in your life starting right now. So check this out. In today's episode, we're going to go through three major points. And the first is teaching you why willpower always breaks down if identity doesn't shift as well. We're also going to talk about how your inner story, the story you tell yourself, is what determines the actions that you take and the decisions that you make. And we're also going to give you the exact question that you can ask yourself to begin to change your beliefs, which will change your patterns, which will change the things that you do. And hopefully, the outcome of this will be that you can start to get on top of those things that you no longer want to do. I remember when I was a young Christian, just starting out, I was so on fire for the Lord, as they say. I was reading my Bible all the time. I was praying all the time. In fact, I read my entire Bible, and I would have hour-long quiet times every morning. And it was an intensity of action. I was doing all the things I knew to do to be a Christian. In fact, I was also going to church every single time the door was open, and it was intense. It was a huge lifestyle shift. And I recall one day, one of my best friends pulled me aside and he said, "Hey, Mark, you're not going to be able to maintain this level of intensity all the time." Now, I got to tell you, in that moment, I was instantly offended. My friend was trying to bring some wisdom to me and speak into my life a bit about important things, and I was instantly offended because the story that I told myself as soon as he said, "Mark, you're not going to be able to maintain this intensity," was that he didn't believe in me. He didn't believe that I could, that I was strong enough, or that I would maintain this level of activity around the things that Christians do. I also thought that he was telling me that I wasn't different, that I hadn't actually changed. And so those two things together caused me to tell a story in my head that sounded like this. Well, if one of my best friends doesn't think that I can maintain this, I got to try even harder. I got to show him. I got to show the world. And so I actually doubled down on the intensity with which I was showing up, these hour-long quiet times in the morning and going to church all the time and learning new languages to speak and the Christianese, as you will, and everything I talked about was different, and it was intense. But it turned out he was right. After a period of time, I missed a quiet time one morning. I didn't read my Bible for a day. And then before you knew it, it was a little easier to miss the next one. And as time went on, maybe I'd miss 2 or 3 days in a row. Before you knew it, I had gone several days without reading or praying. And at times, I didn't even realize it. But my friend was right. I wasn't able to maintain that intensity of action all the time. And it was for a few key reasons. Let's dive into those. Point number one for today is that you actually act out what you believe about yourself in a moment. It's actually insane. This is really well researched and well studied that people believe that they make very logical decisions. And when I say well researched, I mean in psychology, in faith, in business, in personal development, even in the world of managerial economics. This shows up all over the place. We all believe that we make logical, if A happens, then I'll do B sort of decisions. But the truth is that is not true. In fact, it's us sort of lying to ourselves, believing that we're making better decisions than we are actually capable of making. What really happens is we make decisions based on what we believe about ourselves. For example, when my friend said I wasn't going to be able to maintain that intensity for all of my life, I instantly believed that he was telling me I wasn't strong. And so I tried to be stronger. I believed he was telling me something that wasn't true. And so I treated it that way. Here's the deal. If you believe that you are somebody who makes bad decisions, you'll typically make bad decisions. If you believe that you're somebody who is inconsistent, you'll be inconsistent. If you believe that you are somebody who can't stop cursing or can't stop looking at things on the internet you shouldn't be looking at, or can't stop showing anger toward people that you love, or if you believe that you're somebody who never shows up to work on time. You see where I'm going with this? If you believe that something is true about yourself, your actions will typically follow that belief. And if you believe the other way, that you are a disciplined person, you'll typically show up with more discipline. If you believe that you are a person who does the things that a disciple does, you'll typically show up a little differently and do the things that a disciple does. God shared this wisdom with us a long time ago in the book of Proverbs 23:7. And there's different translations of this, but one of them says that for as he thinks within himself, so he is. And really what this is saying is exactly what the research is pointing out now in neuroscience and many other brain-related fields, is that our thoughts and our beliefs actually create our actions. And it was right there in Proverbs all along. What's internal will always show up externally. What you believe about yourself will always show up as your actions. Point number two, your internal story is always shaping every decision that you make. So there's something called the identity model of decision making. This was put out by a guy named James March, who was a professor at a college. And this is another one of those nerdy, well-researched things that I love to look at. But basically, it is the idea that every time we are presented with a scenario or with a question, we're sort of subconsciously, internally asking ourselves, who am I? What is happening? And what do other people who are like me do in situations like this? And so if you put all those questions together subconsciously, we're sort of telling a story. For example, let's say I want to get up in the morning and be a morning person and have a quiet time and pray and read my Bible. So if the answer to the question, who am I, is I'm a person who hits the snooze button, and what is happening, I get up in the morning, hit the snooze button because I'm tired and my bed feels great and I don't want to get out of bed. And what do other people do here? Other people like me also hit the snooze button and stay in bed. And so we sort of tell this story in our head and we justify our actions, and therefore we strengthen those actions, those things that we don't want to be doing. So your internal story is always shaping every decision that you make. In fact, if your internal story is built on past failures or insecurity or shame, then you're typically going to repeat or play out those same stories, and they're going to lead to those same actions over and over and over again. This is a topic for another podcast episode some other day, but a story that I told myself for a long time based on how I was raised is that important people always leave. And so don't make anybody in my life important. Don't rely on anybody. In fact, don't even have deep relationships. It wasn't until I began to tell myself a different story that those beliefs began to change and I started to treat people differently. And you can change your story too. Another scripture for today is Romans 12:2, one of my favorites, which says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the consistent renewing of your mind." If you change your story and renew your mind, your life changes also. Again, evidence of God's design and the power of thought. One more point for today is that transformation doesn't start with action. It really starts with belief. You see, with my story that I shared at the beginning of this, I went straight toward action. Read my Bible, pray, go to church every single time the door is open. But I had not began to shift what I believed. And so those actions were superficial. They were going to fall away once the excitement fell away. They were going to start to waver as my motivation started to waver. And what my friend was trying to tell me is that being a Christian, following Jesus, was more about changing your identity and aligning yourself with who Christ says you are, and then your actions would flow from there. Transformation doesn't start with action, it starts with belief. Now, I got to say a quick side note here. Habits and consistency and working hard on yourself absolutely matter. But what happens a lot of times is we start with all of that and we rely too much on things like willpower and motivation to keep those things going, which, as we talked in the episode just before this, willpower and motivation do not last forever. In fact, they actually get fatigued just like any other muscle in your body or any other emotion that you may have, and you have to refill them. And so relying on willpower and motivation for long-term change is not a good strategy. But focusing on who you are and being transformed into a new person, in other words, shifting your identity, is what leads to lasting change. And remember, we're working on the question, how do we stop doing the things that we don't want to do? And we're tying all this together now to say that the way that we stop doing the things we no longer want to do is to work on who we're becoming, because beliefs lead to actions. Actions follow beliefs. There's a belief underneath the patterns that you have. And so transformation happens when your belief and identity get aligned. Okay. Let me give you a quick exercise that you can work on today. And the one question that I promised was going to be able to transform everything in your belief system. This question actually helps me still in my beliefs as I'm working on myself. And I know that it can help you as well. And so I'm going to give you this question, and your homework is going to be to spend some time unpacking this question for yourself and making sure that you are doing it in a great frame of mind. So maybe sit down with a journal and maybe 10 minutes, if you put on some, classical music or light a candle or whatever your jam is, go outside, sit by a fire, but try to get your mind quiet and really focus on this one magic question that can begin to transform the way you're thinking about yourself, which will transform your beliefs. Here's the question. Are you ready? Okay, so if you need to, pause the episode, write down the question. Don't let this blow by and think that you're just going to remember it. Really write it down. The question is, what do I need to believe about myself in order to act differently? What do I need to believe about myself in order to act differently? This is right in alignment with Ephesians 4:22 through 24, which says to put off your old self and be renewed in your mind, attitude, spirit, and put on a new self. Powerful questions like these and spending time unpacking the answers to them is how we begin to shift our identity to be more like Christ, less like the world. What do I need to believe about myself in order to act differently? All right, you got that question? So as we move on from that question, that's your homework. I want to give you just a couple more thoughts, and then we'll start to wrap up this short podcast episode today. As you are unpacking this question, you can ask it multiple times. In fact, sometimes when I'm coaching people, I'll prescribe this question and ask them to answer the same question for maybe a week or two at a time in their journal so that they're creating repetition of thought that leads to actual changes in the way that you think. And so if that would be helpful, maybe consider doing that. And here are two more questions that you can add on top of this to ask yourself at the end of each day as a way to continually shift what you believe about yourself so that we're shifting what we think about ourselves, so that we're shifting our actions and we're no longer doing the things we don't want to do. Okay, so here are the next two questions, and you can write these down as well. I encourage you to not lie to yourself and think, I'll remember these. I do that to myself all the time. Write these down if you need to. So at the end of the day, ask yourself, what did I do today that reflects who I say I want to become? I'll say that one more time. What did I do today that reflects who I say I want to become? Now, this question has kind of an undertone to it, meaning that you've got to understand who you're becoming. And you've got to be doing that on purpose. And this is what we call an alignment question. If you ask yourself, what did I do today that reflects who I say I want to become? What you're really asking yourself is, did I stay true to the person that I said I want to become? It's an awareness question. Question number two is, what did I do today that reveals what I actually believe about myself? Okay, so this is a question where we're studying our own behaviors to see if the evidence in our life is stacking up with what we say to be true. Question number one is about awareness. Question number two is about evidence. And as we bring more levels of awareness to how we're thinking and showing up in our world, that gives us more opportunities for growth, because self-awareness is, after all, the foundation and the springboard for all growth in all areas. Truly, think about that. Even in your salvation, we had to become aware of the need for a savior. Personal growth is always coming from self-awareness of some sort. All right, that is what I have for you guys today in this episode of the Known Disciple Project podcast. There are a couple of scriptures I'm going to end with, and then we're going to wrap this sucker up. So the truth is that if your beliefs don't change, your actions will continue to be the same. Your patterns will not change. And so if you shift your identity, your behavior will catch up to your new identity. 2 Corinthians 10:5 says we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. This is legitimately how we attack those beliefs. We take captive every thought. So if you have trouble with negative thinking, capture those thoughts, shift them to something positive. If you have trouble with scattered thoughts, begin to just capture a couple of those and unpack them and think about them and work on these questions that we gave you today. And Mark 10:27 says, humanly speaking, it is impossible, but not with God. Everything is possible with God. And this is completely the most important part of all of this. Is we do not grow in isolation as Christian disciples. We have to invite God into this process. So I encourage you guys to pray through all of this. When you ask that question, that first question, what do I need to believe about myself in order to act differently? The second question, what did I do today that reflects who I say I want to become? And the third one, what did I do today that reveals what I actually believe about myself? Also use these questions in your prayer life, because God will reveal to you places where you need to give focus, and we cannot grow apart from God as Christian disciples. If this episode struck a chord with you, or if it hit home, I'd be honored if you would leave a review, drop a comment, or if you want to help the Known Disciple Project create more alignment for Christian disciples in their life, go ahead and share this episode. Also, you can message me on Instagram and I'll respond. If there's something you need help with, I'll pray for you. Or if something in this episode stuck out to you and you'd like to let me know that, I love getting messages from you guys. Until our next episode next week, be known.